And the waters prevailed, and were increased greatly upon the earth. And the ark went up upon the face of the waters. And the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered. And all flesh died that moved upon the earth, both of fowl, and of cattle, and of beast, and of every creeping thing that ever creepeth upon the earth, and every man. I'm Aidan Mattis, and welcome to the Lore Lodge. Essentially, every culture in human history, since the dawn of civilization as we know it, has had a flood myth, whether it be the Sumerians with the Epic of Gilgamesh, the story of Noah and the Ark, or even the Native Americans. According to modern geology, we believe that there was a massive glacial melt sometime around 12,800 to 11,600 years ago. And it's been theorized by some geologists that this was caused by a comet impact in Greenland. The accepted archaeological evidence suggests that there was no complex human civilization prior to this flooding event that would have occurred as a result of this massive comet impact. In fact, agriculture, as far as we're aware, didn't really develop until 9,000 or 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent. So, how is it that we have a megalithic site in Turkey that dates back to 11,600 years ago? To put it in context, the site of Göbekli Tepe, which means pot-bellied hill, is approximately 5,500 years older than written language. It is about 5,000 years older than our oldest known megalithic sites like the Sphinx and Stonehenge. And furthermore, it actually predates agriculture in the region. In fact, agriculture in the region seems to pop up around the site of Göbekli Tepe. If you'll remember back to your world literature class in high school, you probably read the Epic of Gilgamesh, and you were probably made aware that this was the first written literature that we know of in world history. It is the story of a man who is part god, part human, and he goes on a search for everlasting life, among other things. But those are the parts that you usually end up reading, are the story of who Gilgamesh is, of his friend Enkidu, and his search for everlasting life after Enkidu's untimely death. This was all written on cuneiform clay tablets, which cuneiform is a wedge-based writing. It does not look anything like modern written word, but it was complex enough that the Sumerians were able to keep records of grain, of banking, of literature, their language, all of this, and we were eventually able to translate it, going back through using ancient Greek and ancient Hebrew and all of these different languages from the area. It was actually a very complex process that led to the deciphering of cuneiform. But today, unlike the ancient Indus Valley civilization's writing, we can actually decipher it. And what this has led us to believe is, based on the records they were keeping, they developed agriculture sometime around 5,000 to 4,000 BC, and similarly in Egypt, you were starting to see agriculture in the Nile Valley around this time. And it's also possible that we were seeing agriculture in the Amazon as well as China and a few other areas, but the real epicenter of early human civilization is the area of Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, modern-day Iraq. So anyway, what I'm trying to do here is establish the context to make you really understand how old what I'm about to explain to you is. If agriculture itself is 9,000 or 10,000 years old, if the written word is 4,000 years old, we are talking about 11,600 years ago. We are talking about a megalithic site on the scale of actually much larger than Stonehenge that is 6,000 years older than writing, that is 5,000 years older than agriculture, and the accepted mainstream explanation from this that you'll hear in archaeology class is that the hunter-gatherers in the region just somehow managed to put together this site. And they'll say that this is the only thing that's actually supported by any evidence. This is the only explanation that makes even a modicum of sense. But when you actually examine that, it doesn't make sense at all. It makes no sense. Because one of the few things about ancient peoples that we know is megalithic architecture only ever follows agriculture. you must have established agriculture. In fact, for a considerable period of time, because you need a population surplus created by the ability for you to divide labor between the available population. Since farming takes less effort than hunter-gatherer societies do, you can have one person produce enough food to have another 5 people go and do things like create pottery or work on irrigation or count money, things like that. You can spare laborers to go and build these sites. So that means that, you know, if you think about Stonehenge, the Sphinx, all these things, agriculture predates them by usually 1,000 years or so, because you have to have enough time for the population to grow. At Göbekli Tepe, the megalithic architecture predates the agriculture. It comes before the agriculture does. It is entirely outside of the realm of anything we understand from our accepted human history. And when people like Graham Hancock bring this up in Fingerprints of the Gods, the general response from the archaeological community is, oh, that's ridiculous. That's impossible. You're a pseudoscientist, you don't know what you're talking about. Here's what we know, you have no evidence. But the truth of the matter is, their explanation that a bunch of hunter-gatherers in Neolithic Turkey were able to erect 50-ton stones on top of each other to create a perfectly north-south aligned, and we're talking about astronomical north-south, not magnetic north-south. So this could not have been magnetism. This was astronomy. They're saying that these hunter-gatherers had not only the surplus labor, but also the understanding of the galaxy around them to erect 50-ton monuments that are perfectly aligned to north-south 1,000 years, 1,500 years before the earliest of basic agriculture that we're aware of. That is ridiculous. So let's dive into that a little bit. The Sphinx has enough controversy around it because of erosion and weathering, so we'll use Stonehenge as an example. The kind of accepted date for the erection of Stonehenge is about 3000 BC. We know that the blocks were moved several hundred miles from where they were quarried and then erected. There's been some debate over the years over what Stonehenge's purpose was. Was it an astronomical site? Was it a burial site? Was it a ceremonial site? That's not the topic of this video. I'll go into that another time. But this was around 3000 BC. And this was after a fairly long period of inhabitation of the British Isles. This is pre anything we would consider Celtic today. So it's old. They had labor. They had a surplus. They were farming. The way that we believe they erected these monuments was by using lots and lots of people with basic construction techniques like levers and pulleys. We're literally talking about wrapping cords around things, just giant stones, and having lots and lots of people pull on them to create this site that is essentially a bunch of stone blocks on top of each other. At Göbekli Tepe, you could have that explanation, and it would in fact make sense, if and only if we could prove that there was a population large enough to undertake that venture. And the factual explanation by archaeologists is that it was an exceptionally large population of hunter-gatherers who basically just figured out, oh, you know, we can lever this, we can pull on a cord this way, and the stone will move up, and even though we don't have the wheel, we're going to be able to drag giant stone blocks up a hill and place them in alignment with the stars that we don't yet have any understanding of, and then we're going to carve a bunch of pillars, and on these pillars we're going to have art that is indecipherable compared to the surrounding cultures, but actually looks quite similar to that of the Anasazi in America, and then we're going to basically just abandon the site after 1,500 years. That is the factual explanation. I want to really hit the nail on the head there. That's the factual explanation. Is nothing here makes sense, but if we describe it in terms of things that happened 6,000 years later, then it makes sense. It's BS, if we're being honest here. And I understand the frustration of archaeologists who want to dismiss Graham Hancock's work, who want to dismiss the work of people like him who suggest that this was, you know, some sort of highly advanced civilization or something like that, that we have lost the technology from. But you don't discount that kind of theory by just completely ignoring all available evidence. That's not how we do history. That is not what this practice is, what this study is. So what do we have? What is the alternative theory presented by people like Graham Hancock? Well, it has multiple parts, but essentially the idea is that the reason that Göbekli Tepe predates agriculture in the region is because whoever built Göbekli Tepe brought agriculture with them. So these were people who built the megalithic sites that had the technology to do this without a large agricultural population nearby, and they came to this region of Turkey, they established this site, and then agriculture sprung up around it because they taught them. Kind of like how when the settlers arrived in colonial North America, the natives taught them how to grow corn and how to till the distinctly American soil that was very different from the European soil. And this lines up with the catastrophic events of the Younger Dryas period, which is that little 1600 year space between the Pleistocene and the Holocene eras. The Pleistocene is what we commonly refer to as the Ice Age. It was a very cold period. You had glaciers as far south as Minnesota and Denmark. And then, for some reason, that we only recently have started to believe that this was a comet impact that did this. For some reason, we experienced 1500 years where the temperature went from so cold that you had ice caps in the United States to so warm that you had equatorial farming. So what's been put forth by people like Graham Hancock is the idea that perhaps prior to this Younger Dryas period, there was an advanced lost civilization on Earth that we don't have cultural or archaeological memory of. That essentially, whatever it was, it had the ability to project force across the world, and that this civilization was wiped out only by the catastrophic event that was this supposed comet strike in Greenland around 12,800 years ago. And that following this, for whatever reason, whoever was left from this society ended up at the site of Göbekli Tepe, and they built this megalithic structure. And what also has been posited by this wing is that Göbekli Tepe, for whatever reason, was deliberately buried around 1500 years after it was built. That it was essentially preserved as a time capsule, and that some of these pillars that have these ornate carvings that we don't understand are meant to represent the night sky of the time we currently inhabit, the night sky of 10,000 years in the future, that somehow they could predict this was where the comets and the constellations and everything would be. And again, this is the kind of thing that a lot of mainstream archaeologists don't like to accept because it really breaks a lot of rules that have been established to make everything make sense. We, as far as we understand, have a 10,000 year history of human civilization. This takes that and flips it completely on its head. And it also begs the question, how did these people end up in Turkey? Is that where civilization began? Is that where this ancient civilization that we have lost to the unidentifiable past, is that where they were? It doesn't appear so. We don't have evidence that it was. What we do have evidence of is large structures that are currently buried under hundreds of feet of water in the Mediterranean. We have giant granite blocks that look like they were actually quarried, laying in the Caribbean under the ocean, just in the water, dozens and dozens of feet down. Places where there could not have been a building there only 10,000 years ago. That area was underwater. So it must have sunk during the Ice Age, during the melting period of the Younger Dryas, which leaves only the explanation that it was built prior to the Younger Dryas, and that means that humans must have been building things, and if humans were building things, that means that we had architecture and agriculture, and that puts humanity's birth date as a civilization 5,000, 6,000 years earlier than we thought it was, and that's a lot to swallow for any scientific field, let alone one that is so based on constructing a narrative from the available artifacts. So for archaeologists to accept that that's what happened, it's going to mean a lot of people's entire PhD thesis was wrong. That their entire dissertation, everything that they built their academic career on, was wrong. And nobody wants to accept that. But you might be thinking at this point, well, if there was an ancient civilization, why are we just now discovering any sign of it? Why is it that we don't know that this was here? Why is there no record of it? And the fact of the matter is, there's quite a bit of record of it. Because if what we're talking about here is a massive glacial melt, that would cause a flood. And if you look back through history, we've got Noah's flood, we've got the flood in the Epic of Gilgamesh, we have the flood at the end of Ragnarok, we have the flood that wiped out the Clovis civilization, we have the flood that is in ancient Egyptian lore. I mean, there is a flood everywhere. There was a giant flood. And perhaps the most interesting account of this, because it's the only one that involves an actual modern measurement of time, is the flood in Plato's Critias. Critias? I don't speak Greek, but his Critias dialogue, where he recounts that in the time of Solon, one of the founding fathers essentially of Athens, went to Egypt, and the Egyptians told him the story of Atlantis. And Solon was about the 600s BC. Solon was told the story of Atlantis by the Egyptians, and what he was told is that 9,000 years ago, at his time, so 9,600, doing math. So 9,000 years before the time of Solon, before the Athenian classical period, before the Persian Wars, all of this, Atlantis was sunk because of its hubris, because of their inability to accept their modest place in the world, and that this massive flooding event wiped them out, and civilization essentially had to start over. 9,000 years before the time of Solon was 11,600 years ago. And Plato pointed this out with an exact date, down to essentially the decades, that this flooding event that we now know because of our modern geological science just realized this, just caught up. Plato called it in the 400s BC. He knew, and it is completely impossible that they had the science to explain that. There was some wisdom that was passed down, whether it was Plato himself who came up with it, or whether it was something that was passed down to him by Socrates and so on and so forth back through history. Plato called it, down to the century. There was a great flood. It wiped out Atlantis, and we had to start over. So what's this all building to when we talk about Göbekli Tepe and the implications? There was, according to the evidence here essentially, a precursor civilization to what we know as... They're not happy with me. There was, as far as the available evidence suggests, a precursor civilization that was capable of megalithic architecture, agriculture, and probably seafaring. And whether we're talking about advanced in terms of they were able to travel across oceans in wooden ships, or advanced in terms of they had the ability to levitate stones, it's somewhere between there. We don't know exactly where, but it's somewhere between those two things. Mainstream archaeology doesn't want to accept this. World governments definitely don't want to accept this. The only things that seem to accept this are like the Assassin's Creed video games. We need to ask ourselves, what is the missing chapter? What don't we understand? What can we do to understand it better? Were these human beings as we know them today? Were we talking about something like the Nephilim? Were we talking about an advanced race, something that was greater than we are? You know, what was there in the time before? What was the missing chapter? And unless people, the regular people, start asking that question, unless we start pushing the academic community for it, the honest answer is we'll probably never get it. So if you take anything away from this video, it should be question everything, don't trust the authorities, and make sure that when you go into your next archaeology course, when you hop on your next online forum, you ask somebody to consider what we might be missing. Is there something being hidden, or are we simply ignorant? Do we simply not understand? Or is it something that's hiding in plain sight and we just haven't thought to look for it yet? But anyway, let me know what you think in the comments. We'd love to hear your opinions on it. If you want to support the show, please check out our Patreon, which is the Lore Lodge. There's tiers from $1 through $25 a month. Anything helps. Of course, make sure to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and if you share this video, it will significantly help us in the algorithm, so go ahead and do that. You can also join our Discord, which is on the link in the description, and as our socials, I'm the Aidan Mattis on essentially everything. Our director and producer is Aidan Thornbury. He's Director Aidan on TikTok and Instagram, so feel free to follow either of us, both of us. Love us, hate us, make out with us in your dreams, do whatever you must. But I think that's going to do it for today. The weather outside has me concerned that that somebody divine might be angry with me. Without further ado, once again, I'm Aidan Mattis, and thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.